So just to remind you what the objectives of this session are, is to try and understand what are the social and cultural perspectives in development, and what are the contributions of an anthropological approach to development, and then thinking about the role that an anthropologist has in development. Uh, oh, my computer is going mad. Okay. So the role an anthropologist can have in development, or the anthropology of development, and we'll see how those are different. And then thinking more about the anthropological engagements with broader processes of change, and addressing global challenges. Let me know if the slides are moving. So I am moving the slides. Excellent. So what are the sort of central contributions that anthropology can provide to development? So anthropology is and sort of a more qualitative sociology are comparative. So what anthropologists do is they try to seek difference and seek the same processes, to see them in different in different contexts. So a lot of the contribution of anthropology is to critique ethnocentrism, so assuming that the Western way of doing things is the natural way of doing things, uh, and then sort of problematizing universalism. And as you'll probably studied in development, there's assumptions about a pathway that all societies go through, and that it has been problematized by anthropology. So often the focus of anthropology is culture, so understanding that people have different ideas, different meanings, different ways of life, and that their worldviews and collective norms are different. So that we focus on not only the the material realities, but how people perceive it and frame those realities. Has to do with identity, and culture is emergent through practice. It's dynamic, it changes through time, and we're always focused on power and how power relates to culture. So we're always focusing on social relations, we're focusing on power. There's always this notion that there isn't a knowledge that we all shared or do not have, but actually that there's different kinds of knowledges, and that they might be in competition with each other, and that knowledge is not things that you learn at university or you learn in books, but it's about also the knowledges that people have in their everyday lives, in their lived experience. So if you're talking about uh, designing a health service, for example, the actual experience of people living through the health-seeking practice is actually knowledge that is very useful, for example. Or, for example, peasants and the way they farm, they have this embodied way of doing work that they might actually not have verbalized as much as an agronomist, but they're actually very connected to nature and the context they are in. So we're trying to bring those knowledges to the fore. We also, when we talk about power, we also talk about more political economy notions of power, thinking about resources, thinking of access, control, benefits, and particularly in development where there's resources being moved around, we're there to see who gains and who loses from these investments. Anthropology is a very qualitative discipline, and ethnography is like the key methodology, and we'll talk a bit about that. And and that does not mean that ethnography is our only methodology. So actually, anthropology is one of the disciplines that reaches out to other disciplines most frequently. So when I did my field work, I also did some surveys. I did some key informant interviews. Uh, there's people who actually do some natural science on the side. So, for example, when we talk about Second Nature, this um, project that Melissa Leach and James Fairhead did, they also used footage from photos from forests, from plains and satellite imagery. So anthropology is about the qualitative, is about the everyday life, but it works with other disciplines. And anthropology is reflexive, which means that we always think, what is our role in this production of research? Well, how are we, by framing things in a particular way, by relating to our participants in a particular way, how are we actually shaping what we're finding out and the future relationships there? So that is I think an advantage of anthropology that other disciplines can learn from. Okay, so ethnography is this methodology that is basically just seeing how people behave in normal life. So it's not like a psychology experiment where you get people in particular in a particular circumstance controlled, but actually we go and see how things play out in real life. And one thing that is really important, that is holistic. So one of the blindness that development has is that you come with a particular project and a particular discipline, and then you go and say, well, I'm going to look at the trading behaviors of these people. But actually, if you're using an anthropological lens, okay, you look at economic exchanges, but you also look at how does religion shape those economic exchanges? How do social relations frame influence those economic exchanges? So you start with one issue, but you sort of you broaden out to see how all these different factors are shaping that particular thing that you're interested in. So this idea of looking to the whole from the particular. So uh, ethnography is basically just hanging out with people in their context for a very long time. So an ethnography is normally like at least a year long. They tend to be longer, and it's about understanding people, how they actually behave in their everyday lives and how they reflect and react to changing circumstances through time. And it's about ordinary conversation and interaction. And one of the key issues here is that people, so comparing to other disciplines that go and do a survey or do some key informant interviews, is that actually there's quite a big divergence between what people say and what they do and what they say they do. And this is crucial because, and particularly in development projects, where there's always a kind of performance in whether they're doing well, whether they're not doing well, whether you're being a good beneficiary, not a good beneficiary, then actually this is really crucial. And the only way you can do that is by staying there long enough where people actually behave like they really do. So you can say, well, I go to see a uh, like I go to culture events once a month, but then I hang out with you, and actually you don't go to culture events once a month. You go to culture events 3 times a month, uh, once every 3 months. But then it's just that sometimes the wishful thinking of what you think your life is different to what your actual life is. So this is the kind of uh, work that we do. And then one thing that is really important is that, unlike other disciplines, we actually use what they call an emic perspective, which is just a way of trying to understand reality from people's own perspectives. So rather than looking at, so if you're looking at gender, people don't think in terms of gender. They might think about a particular community might think about ways of being a mother, ways of being womanhood, or we would talk theoretically about mutual aid, but actually people don't think about mutual aid. In my fieldwork, for example, people used a lot of terms like help and how that interacted with patron-client relationships. So our job is to not only understand what are the key ways of understanding that an outsider might have, like these kind of theoretical terms, but actually always focus on people's own terms, people's own perspectives on reality, and then try to make it into conversation. So, like I was doing this work around help and local understanding of help. Well, how does that engage to a theory around class relations in the countryside? So that's the kind of job that we do. And so I'm going to give you a snippet of this documentary that I'll share the link afterwards, which is The Second Nature. So Melissa Leach, who was our director till recently, and James Fairhead, they were testing the assumption that people contribute to deforestation, people under poverty. There's this demand for wood, and people just automatically contribute to deforestation. So they went out and they actually contrasted that with the reality. Is it true that that is always the case? And what they did find is that actually in these communities that they visited, and this is why I was telling you about the plane, the photos from planes, in certain areas, there will be an average deforestation of these areas, but there were particular areas that rather than diminish, they actually expanded. And they wanted to know what is happening here. So they interviewed a lot of development practitioners that were always in this narrative of poor people are backward and they are destroying their natural environment, and they go and test whether this is true. And the way they do it, and the way they understand why those forests might be expanding, was through ethnography. So I'm gonna show you what they actually did. Just a second. Let me know if you can hear it.
Management of the landscape, and for a worse forest, depends on what you're going to use it for often, or what you consider to be natural in the.
Fishing is rather than settle down and ask direct.
And use it for often, or what you consider to be natural in the first place.
Can you
But
hear
if
it?
these forests are managed, created by people for particular purposes, then they're going to reflect the qualities that people want from them.
How clearly researchers interpret such qualities depends greatly upon the methods of investigation they use.
Rather than settle down and ask direct questions about how was the forest in your youth, we would ask women about changes in fuelwood species, in farming, in fishing. Fishing is a central activity for women, and a central social activity. When women get together, they laugh, they joke, they work together. We would ask men about changes in the species they were using to construct farm huts, changes in the pests that they were dealing with, and crop diseases, which all provided indicators of what the vegetation at the time was like. Any one source alone carries its own pitfalls. There are problems of interpretation. And therefore, we've combined the study of archives, of aerial photographs, and of oral accounts from elderly men and women in villages. And seeing that they add up to a common picture, one can have much more confidence that that picture is accurate.
Kana jita yando kono sita fira tulen bar yala moti jita yambitu bartinya fira kasia yam fanfe ati damna atimi ibami tumbulu
Koni mula fira barwara
telma fonyo kabo doko woni fira bona mai fira yara barya
Koni follow fira masiaya
kelen amasiya no kono sita ngbe barke tudi lekela abartinya.
Working in a day-to-day way has been the principal method which we have used in our research. It's very difficult to understand the local vocabulary unless you see it in action as people are talking about their soils or their types of grasses and the impact that their cultivation is having on that ecology. And you really have to go in there with your hoe to feel the different earths. to feel the way in which the soil changes with 2 or 3 cultivation sequences, in order to appreciate what people are getting at, to get into the mindset of farmers as they're interacting with their landscape. It's in those afternoon lunch times or in the evenings after a hard day's work as you're walking back from the fields that often people are much freer to talk about what they think about, even though they might be not sure that what they think is perhaps right or whatever. People are more hypothetical. It's through those occasions that one gets a sense of belonging, a sense of being able to talk openly about issues which might be more sensitive if talked about in a head-on way.
If left alone,
so that's a bit of a flavor of what ethnography is like, and the tension there in that what confused the development practitioners was that these communities would do some slash and burn of the forest that they had already created, so that it was precisely understanding that nuance that yes, they did slash and burn, but they were also building these forests that sort of like counter that narrative of poor people always cut down or burn down woodland. So that's just to give you a flavor of the anthropological approach. So what are the 2 types of personas that an anthropologist or an anthropology can do in development? So there's the anthropology of development, which is we're antagonistic observers. So we come from the outside, we look at development, and we look at the social and power relations between the practitioners, the development industry, and the beneficiaries. And we try and show what is happening there. And then there's the other, which is the anthropology in development, which, like many people at IDS, we actually are part of the development industry, and we're just we are reluctant participants. So historically, there's a colonial past of colonial workers trying to make the most of their work, and now it's people within the industry trying to have a bigger impact and not doing harm to their work. So when we're in development, we try to analyze the development interventions and how practitioners relate to beneficiaries, and then we try to give suggestions on how to integrate local knowledge, to tailor interventions, and to showcase social and cultural factors. So we're going to see these two in turn. So give minutes. So anthropology of development is the kind of things that we've done through that is often denouncing the depoliticizing nature of development. We highlight that sometimes when things seem not to work, they're actually working for someone or some institution. And then one of the key things is that there's a lot of assumptions of, well, I've designed this research program, or is actually testing whether that's true. So it's just literally just going to the field and saying, well, is it true that this program is doing what they say they do? So a lot of the initial work in the 90s was around this depoliticizing nature of development. So using Foucauldian approaches, there was a study of state development and state bureaucracies and also international aid, and showing how precisely the framing of those institutions of underdevelopment, poverty, hunger, actually as technical problems, actually avoided all conversations about distribution of resources, power, why people weren't politically incorporated into decisions. So somehow transforming the political into technical, that was one of the most powerful effects of development. And also this idea of a hammer looking for nails is that it just sometimes defining problems in particular ways justifies the existence of the development industry. So if you and in the anti-politics machine, Ferguson looks at a World Bank paper that basically just the way that each problem is framed actually gives justifications and guidance to particular bureaucratic parts of the state. So it's thinking our job as anthropologists is to try to show that development is political, and that and that sometimes that's not a nail, and it requires other kinds of solutions. Yeah, that's. Oh, and the other thing, then there was this. Those are more Foucauldian approaches, and David Moss is a really good author in Anthropology of Development that was looking more at action or actor-oriented approaches, and he showed how a lot of projects that didn't make much sense in terms of the actual outcomes of those projects and the behavior of people within those projects was actually not related to the supposed goals of these projects, but actually just keeping relationships going. And that you will see in development that that's really crucial, and that everyone works around building and maintaining relationships. So when I did my work in a small village in Nicaragua, I saw the leaders accept projects that made no sense for the needs of that community, but that were explicitly accepted so as to open a relationship that would then lead to other projects that might actually be useful for them. So it's always thinking, if this isn't working, well, what, or is not doing what it should do, but what is it doing? So it's always thinking, well, if something isn't working, what is working? So just a reminder that development is the legacy of a colonial venture. So a lot of the problems, and one of the readings that you do have is on Dubois, and he talks about the sort of how Black people were judged with white standards, understanding white standards as being the American standard. So similarly, in development, there's a lot of standards that seem to be that are reflected as universal, but actually they're Western understandings and Western priorities. And then there's a lot of white privilege within the development industry, as you will see. The spaces of decision are progressively, when you get to the higher levels of power, there's more influence by people from white Western backgrounds. So the one thing that is really powerful in the development industry is how they frame social change and how they frame people that are their beneficiaries. So there's a strong problem with, you need to measure something or you need to look at something in order to change it, but then by virtue of doing so, you label, and then there's a risk of victimizing and stigmatizing. And then as part of this colonial venture, there's also this, the way culture is understood, that often when something doesn't work, people are accused of their culture being a barrier to it. So this seminal work by Crew and Harrison, they were looking at improvements in water and home ovens, and the way when people didn't take up those technology developments, often culture was accused as the culprit. So they said, so local people in Africa and Asia are seen as slow to adopt new technology, partly because of culture barriers. These are portrayed in two ways: as barriers derived from ignorance and barriers created by cultural rules. It is therefore natural to argue that it's the role of the promoters of the technology to assist in filling the knowledge gap. So rather than asking why aren't people taking up these technologies, the assumption is it's because they don't know about it and they need to be trained or build capacity in those. And that argument is still really pervasive in development. When people are quote unquote resisting a particular intervention, often is attributed to ignorance rather than trying to seek out other reasons why people might not comply with these programs. So I'm gonna, if I have time, yeah. So I'm gonna give you a bit of an example from my own work. Oh, it's really sunny. From my own work on this aspect. So I did my field work in Nicaragua in Central America, and I worked with farmers who used to plant corn and beans, and this was under Ortega's government, and and I was looking at particular programs that were designed to promote food sovereignty and agroecology. So, and I was looking in a village, looking at all these activities of different NGOs that were promoting sustainable forms of farming. No? So, does everyone know what agroecology is, or shall I give a bit of a summary? So, I'll just give you a bit of a. So, agroecology is the legacy of what was called sustainable agriculture, or sometimes well, yeah, it's this notion of agriculture being in as part of a biological process. So your choices that you do as an agroecologist, as a farmer, are those that sort of work in terms of nature. So it's about expanding biodiversity, nurturing agroecosystems. You use your own farm input, so you use mulch, you use your own manure, but you don't use any chemical input. So very important, you don't use pesticides, you don't use herbicides, and you don't use fertilizer. And you use your own seeds, and then because you're not using these chemicals, you actually use intercropping and you work with nature to avoid pests and to promote fertility. There's a lot of soil and water conservation techniques that you can use, and often it's built on family farming, and you aim for the sustainability of the household and optimum yields rather than maximum yields, which is what the traditional industrial agriculture does. So this is the kind of thing that the government and the NGOs were promoting, and the thing is that there's been 3 decades of this approach being pushed onto farmers. So 3 years in which NGOs and different actors, since the end of the period of the Sandinista period, that they gave it a lot of subsidized input. So after this sort of the neoliberal reform of the 80s, then these projects have been running, and all farmers, the great majority of farmers do conventional farming. So they use pesticides. This is herbicides that we're using, and yeah, and then the question is, why is this happening? So what the NGOs assume is that first, that the implementations of these techniques would make farmers better off. Therefore, if they learned about it, then they would transform those practices, and then they would do it in the future without any support. And then that the lack of uptake is because there isn't enough coverage of these capacity building programs. So these NGOs were trying to get some funds to expand those pilot sites and these training activities. But then is this the case? So a lot of my work was basically just, I farmed with really everyone. So people who were part of these NGOs, but also people who weren't part of these NGOs, people who were connected to development, people who weren't connected at all to development, so they would never go to these community meetings. And what I discovered was that actually one day I was farming, and then this farmer says, "Well, here I would put some barreras vivas and barreras muertas, so these kind of infrastructures that would be agroecological." And he was telling me what the things that he would do, and he had never been involved in development, but actually had quite a nuanced knowledge of soil and water conservation techniques. So then I thought, what was happening here? So I actually started asking all these farmers that weren't connected to these programs, and a great majority of them had this knowledge already. It's just that they chose not to use it. So then I started asking through my work. I started asking myself what was happening. So these farmers had they value these techniques and acquired most of the skills to do them. And then there were some variation. Some people did do some of those techniques. So, for example, diversified production, you could find some farmers that did grow other crops, and this adoption of local and domesticated seeds, that also happened. But all the other activities did not. So basically, through my research, I realized what prevented people from doing that. And there's here, this is this is quite long to explain, but basically, aid had depoliticized these things. So it reduced something like agriculture and food sovereignty, which is something that has to cover something beyond your farm, but actually cover the environment, the economic and political environment where you're in. So they just transform that into, these are the techniques. So the problem is that if you don't have a market that actually pays you more for those seeds that you plant agroecologically, how are you going to survive? There's also the fact that people grow particular crops because they're safe, and they're safe because there's a guaranteed market for them. So how do you actually diversify whilst keeping that safety? Then one of the interesting things is that a lot of these things that require a lot of work to prepare your land. But the thing is that a lot of the people who farm in this place do not own their land. So they're either renting or they're sharecropping. So you wouldn't, and the landowners take good care that you don't end up in the same land every year. So all these labor investments that you would do on your land would be lost when you would be rented a different plot the following year. Then this assumption that family farms are the way things go. Actually, a lot of people rent labor to do the sowing, to do the preparing of the land. So that would need to be costed in, and that's not, under the circumstances, not profitable. And then there's the actual power relations in the household. So you might have a lot of young people attended these trainings, but the decisions were made by older people that own the land. So these young people gathered that knowledge, but they did not have the power to change it. So basically, the assumption here is that you cannot have an assumption that these capacity buildings are going to change anything if they don't come accompanied by structural change. And that has to do with land reform, it has to do with free trade agreements, it has to do with the supporting risk management of farming, and the fact that creating value chains that actually reward well-produced crops, and then also that even if you do that, you still, when you design these programs, you still need to understand what are the intergenerational relations, what are the labor arrangements, and what are the land tenure arrangements to actually promote this kind of change. So I hope you liked this sort of more in-depth case study of anthropology of development. So I was looking at development initiative, and I was trying to figure out if that was actually true. The assumptions that were behind there were actually true. And That's one approach. But then the other approach, which is the one that I follow mostly here at IDS, is to actually try and make development better. So we take for granted the development industry, and we try for it to do less harm or no harm, and actually change the lives of beneficiaries. So what is our job as anthropologists in development? It's highlighting the contextual dimension. So avoiding this kind of blueprint approach that comes as like, well, this worked in Botswana is going to work in Nicaragua. And trying to say, this is a specific context, and you need to tailor your interventions to that context to get better outcomes. And we do so by giving really practical, operationally relevant recommendations or key considerations. So we encourage practitioners and policymakers to think about the political economy, social difference and vulnerability, and cultural logics. So what I mean by political economy is that we need to acknowledge that there's power, that there's structural factors, and that sometimes people do not do things because it's not in their power to do so. So rather, very often development is framed around behavior, and very often it's structural factors that do not enable that. So I was showing an example later in which people were being accused of not washing their hands in a cholera outbreak, when actually there weren't any water points. And the moment where water points were put with soap, people did wash their hands. So people were accused culturally of not being hygienic, and that was just structurally a structural impediment. Social difference and vulnerability, our job is to show that one development policy or one development project has very different impacts on different kinds of people. And at the same time, we show that it's not only that people are victims, but actually they have assets, they have strengths. So even the people that you might think are most vulnerable actually can have assets and strengths. And very often, like in COVID, for example, communities themselves mobilized before any official response happened. So it's understanding those assets and that resilience of different communities. And then finally, cultural logics and community engagement, this understanding that people have different perspectives and use different language to understand what you are trying to achieve. And they might have different priorities. So during Ebola, people, the response at first just saw dead bodies as something to be disposed of, whereas communities in West Africa actually needed those bodies to follow a particular funeral in order for those people to be able to move to the afterlife. So if you don't consider that, then people will not want to hand over the bodies. So in Ebola, there was an agreement that was met. There was a kind of discussion that was had, so as to have rituals that would allow funerals to happen in a way that would allow that transition to the afterlife to happen, but at the same time that they were safe. So it's trying to match those different cultural logics, the cultural logics of the practitioners and the cultural logics of the beneficiaries, and trying to match them. So because we're trying to bring people's perspectives, anthropology has a lot of overlap with participatory approaches, because in the end we want to bring subaltern voices into decision making. So one of the projects that I've been involved in, maybe you've heard it, is the Social Science and Humanitarian Action Platform. And what we do is to try and mobilize existing anthropological research when something happens. So the example I was telling you of Ebola, that was the Ebola response anthropology platform. And now we expanded into any kind of humanitarian emergency to think, who are the anthropological experts? What is the anthropological evidence, and how can we give clear guidelines or clear key considerations to practitioners to tailor their actions to the needs of the population? So I'm going to give you another case study of this, which was the there was a cholera outbreak in Malawi in 2023, and a colleague of ours, a chap, was Soha Karam. She was asked to do a synthesis of what UNICEF called the social behavioral evidence relating to the outbreak in Malawi. So the idea would be to inform the design and delivery of effective communications at the center of the response. So what we were being asked to do was precisely to think about those cultural logics and how you could then tailor the cholera response to those realities. So the things that Soha found out was first that the communities are aware of the danger of cholera, but they're less knowledgeable about the transmission and the prevention methods. And that's affected by the rumors, the myths, and misconceptions about the illness. So some people believe that cholera only occurred in the rainy season. Some believe that wind or bad air contribute to the cholera outbreaks. And sometimes it's thought that it's for particular communities, that is the curses caused by angered ancestors that might have played a role, and particularly in the fishing communities of the Gonde ethnic group. So one of the things that Soha did was to actually show how these different communities had these different explanations of cholera. So the responders could tailor the communications to those understandings. One really important thing is that the response was focusing on sort of, by virtue of trying to focus on hygiene, they were having people associate the disease with dirt and poverty, and then some people would then think it was only unhygienic people who were at risk of cholera infection, when that was not the case. And then at the same time, that was creating fear and stigma in communities that can have a inhibiting effect on the communication efforts. And there were instances in which these people who were perceived by the general population as poor and dirty would then be subject of attack. So is framing those messages to avoid that stigmatization. And then understanding that the relationship with the response it comes from a historical and particularly the distrust that people might have of the response has a historical explanation. So, and then a lot of the explanations were related to that history. So thinking that the mining provoked the outbreak, or that the cholera was a hoax that was created to produce more money for elites, or that the cholera vaccine was a form of population control. So when you understand the dynamics between recipient communities and authorities, you get an understanding of why they're distrusting the response. So what are the kind of things that Soha recommended? So tailoring information to the context. So, for example, accepting that there is self-medication, that people go to traditional healers, and actually working with that system and finding ways of promoting earlier referral to the cholera centers. So, for example, working with healers. So if they identified cholera, they could send someone to the cholera treatment center, strengthening digital strategies, but then acknowledging that there is digital access and that's gendered as well. Adapting communication strategies and channels to context. So trying to get two-way conversations between communities and the response, and identifying for each group what are the formats that people prefer, what are the channels that people actually listen to, etc. Then supporting meaningful engagement in the communities. So when you're designing communication strategies, there has to be co-created with communities. So the response would then get community members, get voluntary and community sector organizations to design the communications outputs with them. So this idea of co-creation, and then involving community actors. So working with trusted leaders, yet understanding that different communities trust different people. And then finally, working with local responders, structures, and networks. So working to support community health workers. So for example, the community health workers in Malawi actually don't have, like, they're not paid for transport, they're paid very poorly, they're not motivated. And what Soha was suggested was kind of capacity building and payments that would modify that incentive system to get those community health workers, which are mediating between the communities and the response. And then, as I was saying before, understanding the role of local leadership structures. So thinking, in what circumstances is traditional leader the preferred interlocutor, in what circumstances is it another, and for what beneficiaries. So for example, the traditional leader might not be listening to women, whereas the midwife would. So is thinking about who are the trusted leaders and bringing them into the response. So that's a case study, I think, which is it was something that was asked by UNICEF to us, and then we provided this information, and that changed the way they did their response to be more tailored to local needs. So that's a good example of anthropologists in development. I was going to give you another example because the previous case study is mostly around cultural logics. And I think also our work can signal structural issues and power, no? So for example, when there was a cholera outbreak in Somalia due to a drought in 2017, there's one thing that I mentioned before, is that a lot of the assumptions that were made in the needs assessment was about people's behavior in hand washing, and actually then we showed that there was evidence from that area from previous droughts that people actually did use soap and water when it was available. In this case, it wasn't. So that's one thing, it's a structural element. But the other thing is that when the cholera outbreak, this in this Somali region in Ethiopia, and when the cholera outbreak happened in there, they actually didn't call it cholera outbreak. So there's this term called the acute watery diarrhea, and that's a term that includes other kinds of diarrhea that are acute. But the problem with that is that people don't perceive it to be an emergency. And it's because countries, particularly governments, feel embarrassed and ashamed of declaring a cholera pandemic because they sort of appear as underdeveloped. So they would actually prefer and forbid the use of cholera, and would actually and promote the use of acute watery diarrhea. And the problem is that communities actually wouldn't pay it enough attention. So if you're not using the local term cholera or dakun in Somali, people are just going to think it's any diarrhea and are not going to give it the urgency that it merits. And some work by Lauren Carruth showed that in this drought. And then another example is then people were not attending the cholera treatment centers or their health centers, and that was because this is in the Somali region of Ethiopia. It was because they were manned by Amharic doctors and nurses that actually Somali people distrusted, because they were actually quite rude and condescending to them. So actually, the makeup of those health services affected whether people wanted to go and see them. And actually, there was an experience, again, Lauren Carruth talks about this, of using mobile clinics in the Somali region, tailored to Somalis and manned by Somalis, that actually were much more successful. So it's thinking about who are the players, what are the power relations, and trying to adapt your response accordingly. And then I was saying that there's a big overlap between participation uh, and the anthropological approach. So in the Rohingya camps in Cox's Bazar, with these refugee communities, there was actually a study that was done on the social and cultural factors that were affecting people's water and sanitation needs. And a lot of these had sort of showed the vulnerability of women and girls, and particularly in terms of the mobility that women and girls had related to Purda, and also related to whether they were married or not. So the camps were assuming that women were able to travel more than they were, and they hadn't realized sort of the both the social and but also the safety elements of that. So what the Oxfam did was to create is to co-design with residents of those camps, with these Rohingya women and girls, to co-design with them the latrine, so it would actually be tailored to their needs. So they did a whole participatory process, which I'll share. I'll share the link afterwards, in which women designed and certain things that a designer, an outsider designer, would not have thought of. So, for example, there's a plank there that is for older women to be able to stand up. There's different elements that were asked by the women and women and girls of the Rohingya camps. So we work in. It's not only that we say, well, this is wrong and this is how you can make it right, but we actually also contribute to these participatory processes to get more voice into how things are designed. So just thinking, this is sort of our IDS view of how development has to change. So yeah, how can we imagine something just not tweaking, but actually how can we imagine a different kind of development? So re-envisaging humanity and nature connections. So I was talking about both the example. So the example of Second Nature, the project that Melissa Leach was doing around forestry, is to understand the complex interaction between humans and nature, reducing extreme inequalities, responding to uncertainties through flexible adaptation and multiple knowledges, challenging capitalist and financial relations, as I was saying in the example of farmers in Nicaragua, fostering inclusive, resilient economies, and reconfiguring citizen-state relations and new forms of power. So both material forms of power, like I was saying, more that political economy, but also the politics of knowledge and whose knowledge counts. And then finally, we're talking Escobar, which is one of these anthropologists of development in the 90s. He was advocating for social movements to be that alternative to development as an industry. So how can we use our anthropological knowledge and that nuance of how we understand identity, how we understand social change, to build those solidarities, local and global? So how can we do this? So we can combine disciplines and methods. As I was saying, anthropological approaches work with other approaches. So in my work, I do a lot of stuff around health and justice. So we work with public health specialists. We work with community groups. We work with sort of more traditional sociologists and economists. So how do we combine all these disciplines to create that change? Then always thinking about how do we create evidence that actually has an impact? How do we give operationally and policy relevant evidence? Working decolonially, so questioning all these power relations within the aid sector, but also acknowledging that that development shouldn't only be the development industry, that we should start repoliticizing other aspects and why we're not involved in the decisions that really affect our lives. So we have in contemporary life, we have a lot of decisions over things that are not entirely relevant to that are relevant to us, but there's others that are more relevant to us. Free trade agreements, whether we're bombing other countries or not, those are suddenly do not come under our. So it's thinking about that repoliticization and working decolonially. Understanding that universality in a sense that there's processes that affect us all, but that we experience them very differently. So it's not universality as in ethnocentrism, but it's universality as that we're all in this together and we're affected by similar processes. And promoting mutual learning and bringing in those other knowledges, challenging power, nurturing alternatives, and then fostering a politics of hope, which is quite difficult these days. But I think it's sort of seeing the strengths of and building on the strengths of communities and people, and then promoting equity, diversity, and inclusion. So that's me.